Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradari Yashodhanandana Braja Janaranjana Jabihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodhanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodhanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamuna Tiravanachari Yamuna Tiravanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Gopinath Radha Gopinath Shri Radhe. Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajagacharya Ashtatara Sadashi Srimad His Divine Grace Abhay Charnaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai, Krantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai, Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai, Jai Nithai Gaur Premanande. Okay, so today's class, for those who just came, we are finishing off the 64 qualities of Krishna as we've been discussing in the last 7 weeks. Last week I'd come to a logical end in terms of the 64 qualities, but this week I thought maybe it's a good idea to continue speaking about the last 4 qualities of Krishna, because I don't think I did enough justice last week. We had 15-20 minutes and I went through 4 of the main qualities of Krishna, which is the primary qualities that distinguish him from other living entities, from other saintly persons, from greater living entities like Brahma and Shiva, and even distinguishes him from the other avatars of Vishnu. So we're going to talk a bit about the last 4 qualities as listed by Rupa Goswami in his Nectar of Devotion. And before we do start, just a quick request for everyone to keep their phones on silent or on vibrate. Yeah, okay, so I've done that myself. Good. Alright, so, alright, number 61. Now, before we begin, generally when we talk about the qualities of Krishna, well, let's take even a step further back. Why do we even talk about the qualities of Krishna? Philosophically speaking, the essence is that Krishna is a person. Just as we are people, Krishna is also a person. And that means he's an individual, just like we are individuals. But the Vedic texts give us information a bit more about Krishna. And these Vedic texts are given by Krishna himself, because Krishna is beyond our understanding, because he's of spiritual nature, whereas we are also spiritual nature, but of a minor degree or a minor quantity. Now, it's mentioned in this connection that Krishna is known as Chetanas Chetananam, Nityo Nityanam Chetanas Chetananam. That Prabhupada often quotes this verse to state that of the eternals, Krishna is the prime eternal. Nityo Nityanam Chetanas Chetananam. So of all the living entities, Krishna is the prime, number 1. He is the supreme. Now why is that? It's because from Krishna emanates, and that is the beginning of the Vedanta Sutra, in fact the beginning of Srimad Bhagavatam, the natural commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. So Krishna is the origin. Even Lord Brahma, the original Kavi or poet, he also mentions that Krishna is the supreme cause of all causes. Now, why do we come to that conclusion? Just a quick background is that just as we are living entities, we also have a source. Just going from the body, we have parents, people who begotten us, and they have parents, and they have parents. And the logic is that when you come to the point where someone has no parents, that's the origin. It's a very logical conclusion. Now, when you come in terms of the body, yeah, you can understand to a certain degree that it will come to an end, that we will find an origin, because matter is temporary. But is matter everything? Is the body everything? This is what the Vedic texts challenge. In fact, spirituality challenges this concept altogether. So, the fundamentals of Krishna consciousness, the fundamentals of spiritual life, is that we are not these bodies, we are spirit souls. We are part and parcel of Krishna. Okay, so with this understanding, then we can appreciate a bit more why great saintly persons glorify Krishna, why do they talk about his qualities. So, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna mentions a very interesting and important text. It's chapter 4, text 10. It's Vitaraga Bhaya Krodha Manmaya Mam Upashita Bahava Jnana Tapasa Puta Mad Bhavam Agataha. That he's telling Arjuna that actually those who are free from Raga, Bhaya and Krodha, these are Sanskrit words for attachment, fear and anger. Those who are free from these, they have taken shelter of me, Krishna, and they have Bhavo Jnana Tapasa Puta Mad Bhavam Agataha, that they have come and attained my destination. They've come and attained Bhava, my Bhava, or my position, not position, but rather my nature. And that nature is of Satchit Ananda, which means full of knowledge, full of bliss and full of eternality. But our body is the opposite of that, like I was explaining last week. That this body, it actually has no pleasure in it. Whatever pleasure we imagine it is just like a drop in a desert. And this body also is not full of knowledge. We are also limited in our understanding. In fact, the difference between Krishna and us is Krishna knows what's happening in everyone's body, whereas we only know what's happening within our own individual body. And sometimes it's better that way, because we don't really want to know what's happening in other people's bodies. So Krishna is able to do that, but we are not. and also the aspect of eternality, and that's enough said. We all know that the body is going to come to an end. It's just a vehicle we use to travel in this material plane, and eventually when it comes to its end, it's finished and we take up another body. And the Vedas actually, Bhagavad Gita, Krishna mentions very specifically there that just as the body changes from youth to old age, from childhood to youth to old age, we're changing our bodies. But what we don't understand, what material nature doesn't let us see, is that actually the body is changing. It's not that we are morphing or the body is transforming. Rather, we're getting a new body at every single point in our life. So at the time of death, it's natural that we'll just give up this body and take up another one. So this is the nature of the material body. Krishna's body is completely different. Krishna and his body are the same. It's Satchit Ananda, which means that it's full of knowledge, bliss and eternality. So Krishna says in this verse of Bhagavad Gita that one who's free from fear, attachment, fear and anger, raga, bhaya and krodha, when they are free from these three things, they're able to attain to his nature. And in the purport, Prabhupada gives like a fantastic understanding of this particular verse. Because if you read this verse and the purport that Prabhupada gives, you'll understand how to attain Krishna's nature very easily. And what's blocking us from Krishna's nature is these three words. Does anyone remember what these three words are? English. Anger, fear, attachment, fear, and anger. So the Prabhupada actually helps us sort of define or understand what these three things are. So what does it mean by attachment exactly? And the attachment he talks about is attachment to this particular body. Because if you think about it, we don't have any desire for spiritual realization so long as we're attached to this material body. Right? If we're attached to the body, we're attached to maintaining the body, we're attached to expanding the pleasures of the body, we have no interest in spiritual life. So that the fear or the attachment rather comes from attachment to this body, which prevents us from understanding something beyond the body. We just take the body as all in all. Because if we accept the spiritual nature of the self, then we need to give up the material platform to be able to access the spiritual platform. So naturally, we don't take up spiritual life because we're very attached to the body and we work very hard to give pleasure to the senses. The second thing is fear. And that fear comes from a long time of playing around in this material world. And that fear comes from, the often saying people say is, once burnt, twice shy. Yeah, you're familiar with this one? So the fear there comes from the fact that, I've been in relationships before, and the other person really didn't give me what I needed, and in fact it came out to be the wrong way, and I got, very disappointed. So therefore, individuality and personality doesn't exist. So what's the need of relationships? When relationships go wrong, you often come across this sort of, because the mind is kind of going towards attachment and detachment. It's going towards enjoyment and renunciation. So when it works, when things work out, then we try to enjoy to the best of our ability. And when it doesn't work out, then the mind immediately swings like a pendulum towards renunciation. And then we give it up. There are two types of renunciation that's often mentioned. And the most primary one that I wanted to touch on was it's called Smashana Vairagya, or cemetery renunciation. And it's a renunciation we often see in a lot from experience maybe, or just by seeing. And that's the renunciation you get when you have a loved one or someone close leave or pass on. And generally we come up with great philosophy to be able to sort of support ourselves during that time. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the material world, we again go back to our original habitual way of living. We go back to our normal scheduled life, and we continue going on and on and on. I'll come to your question. Give me a second. I'll come to your question. Give me a second. He's had his hand up for the last minute. I'll come to you. Give me a second. So this type of renunciation, or renunciation, you often see it. There's also the same principle in New Year's resolutions, right? day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. You're lucky to get to day 5 by the time you realize that it didn't work, right? So New Year's realization has the same sort of effect. It's this type of renunciation of desire or this endeavor to do something, and it just doesn't happen, right? So the mind swings from renunciation to enjoyment. And it's very difficult for us to be able to just focus with determination and to carry out what we actually need to do in life. So what happens is that when relationships don't work out, the mind immediately goes to this extent of rejecting relationships altogether. It doesn't work. Individuality doesn't work. We're not individuals. It doesn't matter to me anymore. And then there's fear. Because when you say that actually, in the spiritual reality of things, we're all individuals, it scares us. Because we have a very negative understanding of individuality in this world. So naturally we sort of extrapolate and sort of reflect it into, okay, so the spiritual world has individuality, and that means you're going to have fights, and that means people are going to have differing opinions, and it's just going to be the same thing here. So that's where the fear comes from. And finally, anger. And that anger comes from having accepted so many spiritual paths, and in the end finding out that they weren't right, they didn't work out. And just being frustrated by this. So these 3 things, they all sort of come and boil down to one simple thing. And that's this factor of impersonalism. This idea of, it doesn't really matter, you only live once, the body is just me, the other person doesn't matter. That sort of idea of sort of cutting off this personal relationship with people, that they're individuals, I'm an individual, we connect, so on and so forth. But we're given these qualities of Krishna to help us understand that actually this is the sum and substance of spiritual life. It's this reciprocation with Krishna that makes life interesting. It makes it more blissful and enjoyable. Because the nature of the self, like I was mentioning last week, was that we're always in relationship with someone or something as a servitude position. We're always giving service to the other person. Alright, regardless of what you may think, when you go to the workplace, you're a servant to the boss. You want money, you got to work for it. Right? A relationship, you have to learn to compromise to be able to be in a relationship. Right? So there you go. It's not that you're going to have your way all the time. You'd be lucky. But it doesn't work that way. So even if someone neglects relationships, with people, they'll even take up relationships with animals like cats and dogs. And they'll serve the cat and dog. Like I remember we often go traveling to the regional suburbs and the regional areas of New South Wales and rest of Australia. And I remember once we were walking down the street distributing books, Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and one of the boys, I was on the other side of the street, so across the street I saw him approach a man. And the man, he took the book in his hand and he had a look and he was quite interested. But then as soon as he was looking through the book, then he said, nah, I don't want it, my life's good, I'm the controller, I've got everything under control, it's all good. But then a couple of meters down the road, then he was taking his dog and his dog had to, pass stool. So then he had to pick it up, put it in the bag and take it. So what he didn't understand, but was quite obvious, was that he was a servant of the dog because he had to clean up after the dog. But why does he do it? Because there's some reciprocation, some relationship is there. There's this desire to have a relationship, some sort of reciprocation. And it comes to the extent that sometimes people who don't have anyone with them, they are subject to the mind. And that's a wild beast in of itself, right? Wanting to enjoy with the mind. But the nature of serving Krishna is the reciprocation you get from Krishna is unlimited and full. It makes you satisfied, nourished. So these 4 qualities of Krishna are very, very dear to those who understand a lot about Krishna as a Supreme Personality of Godhead. Now I'll touch on all of these ones. I'm referring to the book called The Nectar of Devotion, and it's written by Rupa Goswami. And Rupa Goswami has given us evidences from different texts, of descriptions of Krishna and his particular qualities. Because it's great to list qualities, but we need to know actually how these qualities work. What are the evidences? how do we understand Krishna displaying these qualities if it's spiritual by nature, right? Because we need to know the difference, then we'll know what to endeavor for in life. Okay, so the first one, number 61 of the 64 qualities, is known as Lila Madhuri, or performer of wonderful activities. So Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and his names that are given to him are based on his activities. So he's known as Krishna because he's all attractive. He's known as Narayana because he's maintaining all the living entities. He's known as Devaki Nandana, the son of Devaki, because he's the son of Devaki. So on and so forth. Each of his names that we chant, Rama, the giver of pleasure. So all of these qualities that Krishna has, or rather all of the names Krishna has, are based on the activities he performs. So these particular activities, how do they make them any different from any other incarnation of Krishna? Say for example Vishnu or Rama or Nrsimhadev, the half man, half lion incarnation. What makes it different? What makes it different is that these particular pastimes of Krishna are extremely wonderful, that they are not performed by any other incarnation. In fact, these activities cannot be replicated by the other incarnations. We'll take an example. For example, we see the history of Jaya and Vijay and how they had to go through 3 births as enemies of Krishna. But when Krishna came in the first 2 births of Jaya and Vijay, he had to dispatch them or kill them in the forms of the boar incarnation, Varahadev, or in the form of Nrsimhadev, but it was only in the form of Lord Krishna were they actually given liberation. So the activities of Krishna, they are, they're insurpassable by us and by his own incarnations. So the example given in Rupa Goswami's Nectar of Devotion is that the activities of Krishna performed in Vrindavan, they were so, superlative. They were so great that they cannot be repeated by any other incarnation. For example, have you heard of how the residents of Vrindavan, they prayed for Krishna rather than praying to Krishna? Here we pray to Krishna, you know. We ask for wealth, we ask for so many things from Krishna. We, in fact, some of us do a bit of a business bargain with him, you know. I'll put $5 in the hundi and you make sure I get $1 million back. And then we'll worry about your commission. We'll worry about what happens after that. So we make a bit of a deal with Krishna. But the pure devotees of Krishna, they're not like that. And it's quite interesting, all of these 4 qualities, they're all interrelated. You cannot have one quality separate from the other. Like, for example, if he's the performer of wonderful activities, he performs these activities with his devotees. So therefore, the next characteristic of Krishna is that he's known as Krishna who's surrounded by loving devotees. Bhakta Madhuri. So, here's an interesting thing. We're going back to Lila Madhuri. And yeah, we understand Krishna Lila, we have Krishna book, we have all the pastimes of understanding Krishna. Those who don't know the activities of Krishna, you can go to our book table out there. We have pastimes of Krishna in the books. You can read them and relish them. But here in our modern day understanding of Krishna consciousness, of Krishna's activities, we have Sri Sri Radha Gopinath here. On the top altar, they themselves have performed many wonderful activities. And for those who aren't aware, that Sri Sri Radha Gopinath are the most widely traveled deities in ISKCON. And why is that? Is that they've traveled 10,000 kilometers to Sydney, from India, and then back to India, and then all over Sydney again. They come back to Australia, and then all over Sydney again. So Radha Gopinath's activities are also very wonderful. This is our 50th year of anniversary, where we're celebrating 50 years of Radha Gopinath's installation. And Srila Prabhupada installed Radha Gopinath here. Now their history is quite interesting in the sense that when the devotees came to Australia in 1971, they had a place in Bondi. And a particular Indian gentleman by the name of Mr. Singh happened to come across the devotees, and he was very impressed by their devotion. Because here he is, in that particular point in time, Australia's multiculturalism hadn't boomed yet, right? So they were just accepting immigrants. They were just about to accept people from overseas. So for Mr. Singh to see his own culture in another, sort of transplanted or implanted in another culture, he would have felt great bliss, because you feel that sort of wanting of feeling that going back home, back to your original culture. So he felt very impressed, and he thought, okay, I've got to do something for these devotees. So then he went back to India, and he commissioned a set of deities to be sent to Sydney, Australia. When it came here to Bondi Beach, unfortunately the devotees had moved addresses. They had left. They had moved from Bondi back to Surrey Hills, and there was no return to there was no other forwarding address left by the devotees. So as usual, we hear how it was shipped back. They were shipped back to India, back to the care of Mr. Singh. But what we don't know is that the general tenets, or the general principles, or the general procedure taken by those who, especially by the freight companies, is that they'll keep the stock in storage for a certain amount of time until it's collected before it's sent back. So here we have Radha Gopinath coming all the way to Sydney to be worshipped, and then they're stuck in storage for a couple of months before they're sent back to India. So you can understand Krishna is the performer of wonderful activities, because once he went back to India, when Gopinath went back to India with Srimati Radharani, there he had arranged Mr. Singh, he had inspired Mr. Singh to give them to Srila Prabhupada, who was running he was running a Pandal program, or a big program that they run in the town center in Cross Maidan in Mumbai. And Prabhupada brought them back to Sydney. So there is no account of deities that eager to come to Sydney. There's no account of any particular form of Krishna except for Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who is traveling all over the world preaching and giving Krishna consciousness to others. So our Radha Gopinath has come specifically here to accept our worship and our loving exchanges. So that's an example of the performer of wonderful activities. Because Krishna is known as Atmarama and Aptakama, that he is self-satisfied and any of his desires can be fulfilled instantly, right? So he can enjoy. He doesn't need anyone to help enjoy. But still he takes endeavors so that he can become more dear to the devotees, and the devotees can then reciprocate with him. So that's an example of a performer of wonderful activities. That's Shishi Radha Gopinath. Bhakta Muduri, this is number 62 of the 64 qualities. He is surrounded by loving devotees. Now Prabhupada gives this example. It's a very interesting example and helps us understand a bit about the nature of Krishna, of God. When we say Krishna, we don't just say Krishna himself. When we talk about the name of Krishna, we talk about his form. The name and the form, the qualities, the activities, they're all the same. Not just that, but his paraphernalia. Paraphernalia are those things used or engaged in his worship, and also his entourage. So Prabhupada gives a very interesting analogy that the king, when we talk about the king and the king visited a particular province of a country, it's not that the king just rocked up on his own, on his horse, or he just walked there. It's mentioned that the king went with his ministers, his entourage, his army, so on and so forth. So similarly, when we talk about Krishna, we don't just talk about Krishna himself, but everything around him as well. And Krishna is never alone. Krishna is always with his devotees. So in this particular quality of Krishna, the love of the Vrajavasis, or the devotees of Krishna in Vrindavan, their attachment to Krishna was so strong. In fact, it's mentioned that the attachment the devotees had for Krishna in comparison to any other incarnation of Krishna wasn't the same. You could not find such intensity of love between the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, and his devotees as he had interactions with his other devotees in his other incarnations. And the example given is that just as we get disturbed a little when that door opens, it's mentioned that the devotees in Vrindavan, the Brajavasis, they got disturbed when they weren't able to see Krishna. It's mentioned the cowherd girls of Vrindavan, just being mesmerized by Krishna's beauty, that even for a fraction of a moment they felt great absence if they weren't able to see Krishna. So even if Krishna was right in front of them, they'll feel so much anxiety when their eyes closed because they couldn't take enough of Krishna. And here's another example. The gopas, or the cowherd boyfriends of Krishna, the friends that he would tend the cows with in the forest of Vrindavan, they would go through the forest together with Krishna. And naturally, when you go through a forest, you pass through trees. And when you pass through trees and you're with your friends, you'll, for a moment, lose track of them because they go past a tree. It's mentioned that every time Krishna went past a tree, the young cowherd boys, his friends, would immediately feel like they were going to faint out of separation from their best friend because they weren't able to see him for that fraction of a moment. That was the intensity of love they had for Krishna. So that love of Krishna is also sort of reflected in our lives as well. Like, for example, when we leave after a Sunday feast and we go home, we feel that separation as well, right? Separation from the temple, separation from the feast, separation from the devotees. So that experience, or that intense love the devotees had with Krishna, that's only present with Krishna and his devotees. Now this is where that point came, that we prayed to God for things, but they prayed for God. So whenever Krishna got into trouble, they would pray to God that please save Krishna, please protect Krishna, because their mood of devotion to Krishna was so great that it surpassed their knowledge of his opulence of being the Supreme Person. They saw him as a friend, a lover, a son, a master, and that relationship with Krishna was the perfection of their life, because that's when the relationship with Krishna was so strong they were satisfied. Because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for love. We're looking for reciprocation. We're looking for a proper relationship with other living entities. But unfortunately, we're all limited. And that limitation always gives us that sort of like a pinprick. You know, when you fast, or you wake up and you haven't taken breakfast and you're running for work or university or something, and you feel the pangs of hunger, that's what it kind of feels like in relationships. There's always that feeling that this is too good to be true. There's something that's going to come and ruin it. That's the nature of material existence. But with Krishna, in relationship with Krishna, such a thing doesn't exist. Because material nature is temporary, you will go through difficulty. Things will come into existence and will go out of existence. But in spirituality, it's eternal. It always stays. Now, there's another example given, or a story given, that there was a great saintly person by the name of Narada. And he went and visited Krishna in Dwarka, in his palaces. And when Krishna was in his palace, and Narad Muni appeared there, Narad Muni saw Krishna in a pained condition. And he asked Krishna, so what's wrong, my lord? And Krishna told him, I've got a headache. And Narad Muni says, so what can we do to cure it? And he said that, well, I just need the dust from the feet of my devotees. Now this concept of dust from the feet of devotees, or it's an expression of humility. It's an expression of how that person is greater and that we are serving them. Can you imagine if you go to the president or the prime minister of the country and you tell them, you do this and you do that and you wash my dishes and wash my clothes and that sort of stuff? It kind of sounds very ridiculous, right? So this concept of giving the dust of the lotus feet to the Supreme Personality of Godhead is kind of transgressing all sort of moral principles, right? It's not like, as children you do it, but it's not like you go and tell your parents to wash your clothes, right? Yeah? There's not many kids here, so you won't get the joke. But anyway, the point there is that we have a certain level of respect for the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So Narad Muni, the saintly person, traveled throughout the universe looking for devotees of Krishna to give the dust of their lotus feet. And each one of them vehemently denied. How can you give dust of the lotus feet to the Supreme Person? Like, who do you think we are? You're going to send us to hell. Make us live in a difficult condition of life. So then, Narad Muni happened to visit the gopis, or the cowherd girls, the cowherd damsels of Vrindavan. And he had told them of Krishna's position, that he is living in the palace in Dwarka and he's got a headache, but he needs the the dust of the feet of his devotees. And the gopis immediately gave as much dust as possible. And Narad Muni was confused. You're devotees of Krishna, do you understand that what will happen? They said, yeah, we don't mind anything happening to us, just make sure that Krishna's headache is cured. So the mood of Krishna's devotees is always that of pleasing the Lord for his senses, not their own, to the superlative degree. So they weren't looking for happiness, they were just simply looking for the happiness of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this is the crux of our religious practices, love of God. You may be practicing any bona fide religion, but the crux is, are you developing love of God? If you're not developing love of God, then your practice, something's wrong. So another essential quality of the Lord, of Krishna, that separates him from any other living entity, including incarnations of himself, that he's surrounded by his loving devotees. Now, the second last quality of Krishna here, mentioned in the list of 64, is that Krishna's attractive flute. Last week I touched on it, how a German scholar happened to visit India, and his desired objective was to find out which of the supreme deities that these people were worshipping is the supreme. And so he wanted to know the supreme person. And so he traveled throughout the length and breadth of India. And he finally came to a conclusion. And one of his friends asked him, so what did you finally conclude? What did you come to understand? And he said that Krishna must be the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And his friend said, so what made you come to that conclusion? And he said that, well, he's just playing his flute. All the other ones are doing something. So Krishna's all play, no work. Right? Exactly what we want, but we can't have. I'm sorry, you have to work. You have to do your duty, and you have to offer the results to Krishna. But Krishna's all play and no work. And that's how attractive his flute is. Simply by playing on his flute, he's able to perform so many different activities. It's mentioned that at the dawn of creation, when the first living entity was born, he was instructed simply by hearing the flute of Krishna. Just hearing the sound vibration. And Prabhupada says that the sound vibration of Krishna's flute is the Hare Krishna mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So that's the sound of Krishna's flute. You wanted to know the sound of Krishna's flute? Chant Hare Krishna. That's the sound of Krishna's flute. And it's so attractive that it's mentioned that the residents, again we're talking about the residents of Vrindavan, they would mention that they would talk to Krishna's mother Yashoda. When your son plays on his flute, Lord Shiva, Lord Brahma and Indra, these are the three topmost positions in the material world that are occupied by the greatest persons, materially speaking. Not like, the President of America or that sort of stuff. We're talking about big personalities ruling the universe. Although they are supposed to be the greatest learned scholars and personalities, they all become bewildered. Because they're trying to assess and find out, what is this sound? Where is it coming from? What sort of melody is it? What tune is it? What is it trying to convey? And it's an overload, They're not able to understand it at all. Although they are very great personalities, by hearing the sound of Krishna's flute, they humbly bow down and become grave from studying the sound vibrated. So Krishna's flute, when he plays it for different things. It's mentioned that he has three different types of flutes. Each one vibrates a different sound, and each one has a different purpose. So when he plays the fifth note during the autumn night, he's calling his pure loving associates to associate with him. When he's a low flute sound, a very low sound, then he's calling his cows. So different sounds indicate different interactions Krishna has with his devotees. But in general, it's mentioned in the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. As you go out, you'll see a whole set of Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam is the commentary, natural commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. It's written by Vyasadeva himself, the personality that compiled the Vedas. And just simply by reading that text, the Srimad Bhagavatam, one can attain self-realization very easily in this life. And in that text, the crux or the central portion, the 10th canto, if you go to the 21st chapter, it's called "The Gopis Glorify the Song of Krishna's Flute." Now, for the want of time, and also to encourage you all to read in your own time as well. I'll just touch on a certain sections of this particular chapter that talks about Krishna's flute. Now, when Krishna plays his flute, it's mentioned the peacocks dance madly when they hear Govinda's flute, and when other creatures see him from the hilltops, they all become stunned. I don't know if you've experienced it, but you know, when you hear mundane songs, normal songs on the radio and things like that, sometimes you seem to get a really good tune, and you just feel like, wow, that is so good. But the problem is, it's after a while you can't listen to it again. But anyway, let's not talk about the negatives, right? So when you listen to it, you feel absorbed, you feel kind of like stuck to a certain spot, and the tune sort of overcomes you. Krishna's flute does that, but to the highest degree. To the extent the happiness and the joy one feels completely stuns them. It's like, again, an overload, but a good one. So another particular quality of Krishna's flute is that the cows of Vrindavan, when they're drinking the nectar of Krishna's flute, their ears are tilted upwards, because the cows, you know, their ears are very flexible, and it appears to be like a vessel by which they drink the nectar of Krishna's flute song. And the calves that are drinking the milk from their mothers, they become stunned and remain stuck there, drinking in the beauty of Krishna. Which leads us to the last quality of the four of Krishna, which is his Rupa Madhuri, or his exquisite beauty. Now, Krishna's exquisite beauty is mentioned by Uddhava, where he says, "My dear sir," Uddhava is a very intimate or very close associate of Krishna, and it's mentioned that it was very difficult to see them apart, except for the fact Krishna had a couple of features that distinguished him from Uddhava. Uddhava is always with Krishna. And Uddhava is describing Krishna, because while Krishna played the role of the king, Uddhava was his, his advisor. So whatever Krishna did, wherever Krishna went, he was always there ready to serve him. So Uddhava, he tells, "My dear sir, Krishna's form was most wonderful when he appeared on this planet and exhibited the potency of his internal energy." Because you see, the essence, or the prime reason Krishna comes to the material world is to attract us, to understand that there's something more than to enjoying this material world, that actually we are supposed to engage our minds in Krishna's service. So Janma Karma Chame Divyam, that it's mentioned that simply by, if you understand Krishna's pastimes and the appearance of Krishna, then it's very easy to go back to Godhead, back home, back to Godhead. So therefore he comes to perform these activities so that we become enchanted and enthralled. So it's mentioned here that his wonderfully attractive form was present during his pastimes on his planet, and by his internal potency he exhibited his opulences which are striking to everyone. Now this mention of internal potency, internal energy, is just to let us know that actually Krishna didn't have a material body like us. Krishna operates on a totally different platform. We have we are the spirit soul covered by material energy, whereas Krishna is pure spirit. His personal beauty was so great that there was no necessity for his wearing ornaments on his body. In fact, instead of the ornaments beautifying Krishna, Krishna's beauty enhanced the ornaments. So in other words, when you look at Radha Gopinath are dressed every day, and at least they're dressed in the morning and in the evening after the 7 o'clock arati. So when you see them at 9 o'clock and 4:30 in the morning, you'll see them with a bit less jewels, but they'll be so exquisite. They'll be extremely beautiful to watch and see. Very difficult to take your eyes away from them. And especially if you watch Mayapur TV, you'll see them even more magnified. Right? Sometimes I have to do the COVID registration thing here in the temple room when everyone comes. But people think I'm working really hard behind the computer. But actually I've got Mayapur TV because I'm sitting all the way back there. I can't see him. So I've got it zoomed in and I'm just, I've got front row seats. Everyone else is struggling on the front. So when you get to see Krishna, Krishna is extremely beautiful, very attractive. Another one, this is Krishna's bodily beauty and in relationship with his flute. The gopis mention that what to speak of women, even men, strong-hearted men are subject to falling down from their position at the sound of your flute. In fact, we have seen that in Vrindavan, even the cows, the deers, the birds, the trees, everyone has been enchanted by the sweet vibration of your flute and the fascinating beauty of your person. In this particular day and age, Krishna is incarnated as himself, but he is incarnated in such a way to teach us how to be a devotee of him. And his name is Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, his weapon in this particular day and age is his beauty. And simply seeing him, taking darshan of him and his devotees chanting Hare Krishna, one is able to experience the same enchanting nature of Krishna playing on his flute. And that's a very significant point to understand, because sometimes we think that Krishna is not here, he's in his abode and he's doing his own thing, and what about us? We're supposed to also be enchanted. What about us? We're also supposed to go back to Godhead. But actually everything is present here. It just requires the right vision. And that vision comes from understanding from a person who understands Krishna. So Srila Prabhupada has given us all of these books. He's given us all these qualities. And therefore we have these books that describe Krishna. And nowhere will you find in any other tradition, in any other sort of religion that preaches love of God, the qualities of God, the characteristics of God, the activities of God. Because what happens is that to be able to explain God's activities, to explain who God is, this requires a very important amount of knowledge. It requires a process by which you can experience His presence. And more importantly, you need to know what the difference between the self and God is. Because if you don't understand these basic principles, it's very easy to mistake God as just one of us. Just another ordinary living entity who was pretty lucky in his life. Right? That he just happened to have everything. He had it really good. No worries, mate. Yeah, he had it all. But that's not the point. The point here is that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He always has it all. Whether you like it or not, He has it all. And He's willing to share. He's willing to share to the extent that He Himself comes as a devotee. He's willing to accept that sort of inferior position of being a servant of the devotee. And that goes to show how much those who strive to go to the position of God don't really have it right. Actually, the position of being the servant of God means you're more of a controller than God Himself. Because the Lord comes under the control of your love. So these qualities are meant to help bring out this love, bring out this relationship. Yes, we read the books for the knowledge. Yes, we read it to understand step by step how things work, the philosophy. But actually, ultimately, there's another aspect of it, and that's the reciprocation you get from Krishna. That's the loving exchanges you get, and you get to see between Krishna and His devotees and experience in your own life. So, this is the last point I'm going to make here. It's mentioned here by Rupa Goswami in his other work, Lalita Madhava. It's a drama he's written of Krishna in Vrindavan. And he says, one day, Krishna happened to see the shadow of his beautiful form reflected on the jeweled foreground. It's mentioned in Vrindavan, we say the cowherd pasturing grounds, it's a farm, it's a forest, and so on and so forth. But it's mentioned in Vrindavan that the rocks in Vrindavan, they were jewels, known as Chintamani jewels. Chintamani jewel, when it touches any particular metal, it makes it into gold, a touchstone. And in Vrindavan, it was so abundant, people walked all over it, not caring for it so much. So one day Krishna happened to see his reflection in those jewels. And upon seeing his bodily reflection, he expressed his feelings. How wonderful it is that I have never seen such a beautiful form. Although it is my own form, still like Radharani, I am trying to embrace this form and enjoy celestial bliss. This statement shows how Krishna and his shadow reflection are one and the same. There is no difference between Krishna and his shadow reflection, nor between Krishna and his picture. That is a transcendental position of Krishna. So Krishna is there displaying the attractive nature of his form. So I'm going to go through this one point again. I started off on it last week, but it's very important to remember that the above statements describe some of the wonderful reservoirs of pleasure within Krishna, as well as the transcendental qualities of his personality. The transcendental qualities of Krishna are compared to the ocean. Does anyone remember why it's compared to the ocean? Can anyone take a guess?
Unlimited.
Oh yeah. Are you sure? Yes. Just as one cannot understand or estimate the length and breadth of the ocean, but you can understand the ocean's contents simply by studying a drop of the ocean, similarly these statements will give us some understanding of Krishna's transcendental position and qualities. So that's the main purpose why we go and understand a bit about Krishna, so we can become more further attracted to him and understand more about his position and qualities, thereby, getting over the three things, the three obstacles. Remember the three obstacles?
Anger.
Yeah. Yes, don't be angry. Yes, anger, fear and attachment, correct. So by understanding, and I hope you're not insinuating anything here, Prabhu. Yes, anger, fear and attachment. So these three things, if we're able to overcome in relation to Krishna, then we'll be able to easily become situated in relationship with Krishna, in his nature. And we can easily understand that by just practicing Krishna consciousness. If we just read about Krishna, appreciate Krishna's qualities and chant Hare Krishna, very easily we'll be situated in his nature. Okay, it's 6. I'm waiting for the next speaker to come. So we have some time. If you have any questions or comments. Yes, sir.
As not appropriate place for renunciation. So where is the best place for renunciation?
I think the idea behind cemetery renunciation is that the concept of when we lose someone, it's unpalatable to hear, but when we lose someone, the general mentality is we become a bit sober. We become a bit more philosophical in life. We don't become so overly aggravated and agitated by passion or desire to enjoy the senses. We kind of come to our senses in one sense and understand actually life's pretty temporary, what am I doing with life? But the nature of material existence is that it covers us over, it makes us forget very easily. So then, a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, a couple of years, and then by the time you realize it, the next anniversary of that particular person's disappearance, you realize that, hey, how did I slip back into my old ways? How did I go back to what I was doing? That's the nature of material existence. So rather than, we're not talking so much of the place, but that's taken, that type of renunciation or that temporary renunciation is taken all over throughout our lives. And the example I gave was of the New Year's resolutions. So the idea of renunciation is that it should be supported by proper knowledge. It needs to be supported by proper activities and culture. That's the most important thing, culture. Culture is the framework by which you can apply this knowledge and philosophy. And that means culture doesn't necessarily mean, people sit on the floor and they listen and they eat, on the floor and that sort of stuff. No, culture you're dealing with more to do with being human. You're dealing with proper etiquette, proper morals, proper interactions. And that allows us to be able to practice the philosophy of renunciation. And not dry renunciation where, you just give up everything. Like Prabhupada gives this example, People have this idea of renunciation, I renounce the bank, that sort of thing. But the bank doesn't really belong to you. How can you renounce it? It's the same way, we say, I renounce sweets, or I renounce this and I renounce that. But actually it's all temporary, because what generally happens after a period of time is that you'll end up doing it again. If you don't do it again, the urge drives you crazy, right? And in fact, it doesn't really belong to you in the first place anyway. Just like the bank doesn't belong to you. Similarly, whatever you possess generally doesn't really belong to you. So what happens is that renunciation is perfected when we engage the activities in Krishna's service. When we use it for the proper activities of dharma or duty. And that's culminates in doing everything for the service of the Lord, for service of love of God, for Krishna's pleasure and not our own. So that's the proper use of renunciation. So we're going from detaching ourselves from sort of bad habits and things, that's great, but what's the positive alternative? Now we need to develop the good qualities and engage them in our activities. And that's what culture is. Culture establishes a framework by which we can express ourselves in that way. Yeah? Any other questions? There was a boy here. Shriman Nishingha, Bhava Vibhushan. Okay, yes. Oh yeah, the second renunciation. Good, I was waiting for someone to ask me about that. Good. The monk renunciation is another unpalatable thing for those who enjoy the material world. It's known as the Markata Vairagya, that monkey renunciation, in the sense that the monkeys will live in the forest and they'll appear to be great ascetics and saints, but they'll have many wives. So similarly, our minds will assume that position of having, I've given up this and I've given up that, and my head's in the air and that sort of stuff. But the problem is that what's really there in the mind? What are we really attached to that will remain there in the mind? Like you'll see many bogus yogis and swamis, and they'll profess renunciation. They'll profess so much spiritual practices, but when you actually have a look at their personal lives, many of them let you down. Many of them let people down. They'll get embroiled, they'll get stuck in so many controversies and so many things. And Krishna talks about that in Bhagavad Gita, that it's better to be, Prabhupada says it's better to be a sincere street sweeper than a charlatan meditator. In other words, it's better to be simple and sincere rather than a cheater. Practice spiritual life at our level. Yeah. So that's Markata Vairagya, or monkey renunciation. When one professes to be of a certain caliber of renunciation, but they're not really practicing what they preach. So that's the second renunciation that is generally avoided. There's a verse by Rupa Goswami that mentions that real renunciation is using, like I was mentioning before, using everything in Krishna's service. But what false renunciation is, he refers to a river, Falgu Vairagya. And this river, Falgu, it's in relation to a particular river. There's a river by the name of that Falgu. And it's mentioned that the river, when you go and see it, it's actually a dry bed. There's no water. But actually if you dig, the water is flowing underneath. The water is flowing underneath that rock. So in other words, external show of renunciation, but an internal display of attachment. That's false renunciation. Rather, what should be done is engaging all of our attachment in Krishna's service. We accept it. Okay, I'm attached to it. I have it and I have a desire. Now let me engage it in Krishna's service. That is the perfection of renunciation. Okay? Are there any last questions before I wrap up? Okay, thank you very much for listening. That wraps up our 64 qualities of Krishna. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande. So we request everyone who are able to stay back. We're having the Jagannath Snan Yatra, which is a festival commemorating Jagannath's appearance in this world. So it's on the 25th, if I'm not wrong. Can you have a check? I'm pretty sure it's the 25th of June. It's not this coming Friday, but the Friday after. And it's 25th, And so what's happening is that we'll be having a public bathing or Abhishek of Lord Jagannath. We're expecting a lot of devotees to come, so we're inviting everyone else to come along as well, more the merrier. And we also have a request that we have sponsorships. So those who are able to please sponsor something for the festival and be part of the festival. So the next class we're going to be having by Bhava Vibhushan Prabhu is on the glories of Lord Jagannath. So we can understand a bit more about Lord Jagannath. Because many of us come to the altar, we see the altar, we see Radha Gopinath, and then we move on. But we don't see the other forms of the Lord, Jagannath, Baladev, Subhadra and Gaur Nitai. So it's always good to hear about them and their activities. So please stay if you do have time. Otherwise the Sunday feast is being served outside. You can take the feast and then come back. Hare Krishna. That I'm not sure of. I'm not aware of that. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Hey Prabhu. Sure.
Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Ballabha Girivaradari Jaya Gopi Jana Ballabha Girivaradari Jaya Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare